You read this passage and it's clear that God is up to something, and God is involved in the nation of Israel in ways that would cause us to be slack-jawed. But the truth is, you ain't seen nothing yet. I know that God has been faithful in 16, and I know there's a real sense of how God has brought us and what God has done in our lives. Over the rough mountains and the difficult roads, God has been good. But you ain't seen nothing yet. Keep in mind that God is dealing with Israel in a way that is helpful, I think, for us here in the 21st century. And the reality is that while we start every first day of the new year sort of thinking that something has ended and something has begun, I think the real truth is that it's just a continuation. We really haven't ended anything, and we haven't begun anything new. It's just a continuation of what has been going forward. And yes, we can look backwards and we can say to ourselves, there are things that we wish we regret, wish we had done over. There are some choices, some decisions we would not have made. And I think that's consistent with what it means to live life. In fact, show me a person who has no regret. I'll show you somebody who has not lived. It's impossible to not look back on the year gone by and not recognize that sometimes there were things that we had to endure, and some of it was the result of consequence, and some of it was just circumstance. There were things that we had to endure through 2016, and now, similar to the nation of Israel, they have found themselves in a particular place resulting out of some consequence and some circumstance. In fact, what you have in this text is God coming out of 42, having asked them why they are in exile. And it's not by accident. It's not because of Babylonians' great power, or Babylon's great power. Ezekiel had been speaking, Jeremiah had been speaking, and there simply was no learning from very obvious lessons. And one of the things that I think is significant about us is that every now and then we should at least acknowledge that everything is not the devil's fault. I think it's problematic for me to always be pointing to the devil as the source of this, that, or the other thing. Because if the devil is the source, then you're thinking with a kind of paganism that is more dignified but not biblical. The truth is that nothing happens without God's permission. Good or bad, it has not occurred unless God has permitted it. There are some people who call it permissive will, etc. You can find a host of names, but here's what I want you to know. The devil's not in charge of anything. The devil doesn't create anything, and the devil is not in charge or running anything. And so it's unfair to always look at some things and point to the devil. What you must do is recognize the source of everything, and that is our God. And if God is the source even of the tough times, then when I'm going through tough times, I go back to God to help me pull through and be what it is I need to be if I'm going to make it at all. This is their predicament. And the great thing about this text, at least in the mind of Dan Williams, was a part of what I heard the choir sing earlier, to remind us that his love never fails, never gives up, and it never runs out. You see, the thing about God that I appreciate is that even in wrath, I find mercy. And so the question now is, Lord, what do we do? How do we respond to this? And what God says to Israel is, be clear, I'm going backwards in order to refresh you of who I am and who you are, because my love never fails and it never runs out and it never gives up on you. Are you glad that you serve a God that never gives up on you? Wait a minute, am I the only one to appreciate that? This is why, no matter how bad it's been, it's always ridiculous for you to give up on yourself. Why would you give up on yourself if God doesn't give up on you? If God doesn't give up on you, it makes no sense for you to give up on yourself. It tells me that as long as I'm alive and there's a beat in my heart, I can survive this, I can come through, and I can make it. Here inside this passage, you've got this reality because you've got a God who goes back to the creation. He says, I want you to realize that you don't have to be afraid. He says, because I created you. and then I formed you, and then I redeemed you, and then I called you by name. In other words, he takes them all the way back through a biblical narrative to the Genesis account, to a creation, to help them to understand this is who you are, this is where you come from, and this is what I've done. I created you, I formed you, I redeemed you, and I called you by name. He wants them to be clear about the framework of how he's done this, because when God takes the time to call you by name, it's because God is trying to make a statement that has nothing to do with just your handle. You see, you and I live in a world where handles mean something to folks, but no, when it comes to God, the one who has created us and the one who has formed us and the one who has ransomed us and the one who has called us by name, there is a significance there in biblical context that you cannot miss. When God calls by name, it is not just a matter of identity, it is a matter of intimacy, it is a matter of authority. Because when God calls by name, God is not just trying to get your attention, he's trying to communicate something about himself and how he feels about you. It's why I have a problem in the 21st century as a grown man having to deal with youngins who call me Dan. See, I was raised in an environment in which if somebody was grown, you couldn't just call them by their first name. You had to put a mister or a brother or something on it, because you didn't have that kind of familiarity with the person you were speaking to. There was a hierarchical distinction to be made. And one of the things that drives me nuts is when I have to interact with young children who think they know me so well, neighbors and sometimes friends, who all you have to do is walk up and just call me Dan. No, youngin', put a handle on it. I also feel the same way when people call my house for money. And the phone rings and I pick it up and they say, "Hello, Dan." And always my demeanor changes with a kind of, "Who is this?" Because what I want you to know is that you don't know me well enough to call me by my first name. My name ain't Dan to you until I figure out who I'm talking to. Now, if we have that kind of intimacy, then you can call me by my name. But if we've never met and you just trying to sell me something, that ought to be Mr. Williams, because you don't know me like that. And one of the things I like about God is that God calls us by name. Why? Because God knows us in a way that nobody else knows us. That's why when God calls by name, it's a matter not of identity, it's a matter of intimacy, and it's a matter of authority. Why does he call by name? Well, since I created you, and since I formed you, and since I redeemed you, I have the right to call you by name, and it identifies how I feel about you, even if you don't feel the same way about me. That's a good God. And that's the kind of grace that we need to embrace, especially as we come into a new year. I'm glad that he knows my name. I'm glad that he knows my every thought. I'm glad that he sees each tear that falls and he hears me when I call. I'm glad that he knows my name. And when you move into this new year, you want to be moving in this new year appreciative of this God who calls you by name, but recognizing that there is this new direction that all of us are called to pass through. In fact, here in the text, he makes it clear that I've called you by name, you are mine, and when you go through deep waters, he says, I'll be with you. He says, when you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. He says, and when you walk through the fire of oppression, he says, you will not be burned up. Now, here's what I want you to be clear about. He didn't say you wouldn't have to go through. That's a poor theology that somehow seems to emancipate us from having to go through tough times. In 2017, I need you to be clear, your rough road is not ended. He has made no guarantee that folks will not die and leave you. He has made no guarantee that you will not get sick. He has made no guarantee that you will not have to experience calamity of any sort. He has not told us in this text, nor them, that they won't have to pass through anything. But what he has said is that when you go through, what I'm promising you is that you'll never go through all by yourself. That when you pass through the deep water, you won't drown because I'll protect you. When you pass through the fire, you won't be burned. And again, he was working in this posture of helping Israel to look backwards and realize what he had done. You see, he brought them through a Red Sea. And in their exile, he was helping them to go back to the memory of recognizing Daniel and the Hebrew boys who had been tossed in the fiery furnace. And he wanted them to realize that while you might have to pass through some things, in the midst of those situations, circumstances, I'm going to be right there with you. And I'm glad that I don't have to go it alone in 2017. In fact, I'm glad that he walks with me, talks with me, and I'm glad that there is this hope for us that comes from his side. You see, this is not because they're so great or because it's something that they've done. He helps them to recognize that there is this new dimension. That's why verse 1 begins, but now. Because you're looking at God in the midst of these contrasts, helping them to realize that what I'm about to do does not come from your side, it comes from my side. Because God, when you read the scriptures, God, there is always grace that precedes law. Every time God works, there is always grace that precedes something else. It is never you doing right and then being the recipient. It is never you doing this and then God being gracious. It is always being gripped by the grace of God, which is why I said if there's hope for us at all, it comes from his side, not from our side. This is why when you look at the way God has laid this out throughout the biblical record, God has this way of giving to us and providing for us his grace and holding some things in lieu of what he wants to do for us that are not totally predicated on what you do or what you don't do. It is not an advocacy for not doing right, but it is a help so that we recognize that even the good we do, we can't take credit for. Because when it comes to God, grace always precedes law. Somebody says, well, Williams, that's not true because when I read the Old Testament and what I see is the law. No, you ain't reading it right. Because if you read the Old Testament and particularly this passage, what you don't see is law, you see grace. Because when it comes to God, grace always precedes something else. This is why in Genesis 1, the devil was so effective in dealing with our forebears, Adam and Eve. Because what he wanted to convince them was that God is not nearly as good as you think. That's why he said, well, listen, in the day that you eat thereof, he says, don't worry about it. You won't die. You'll just be like him. Because God is holding something back on y'all because God can't be that good. And if you ever believe that, then you are falling for the same lie that the devil told in the Genesis account. Because what you've got to conclude in your mind finally and fully is that God is not holding back on you, that God is so good until he's indescribable, that God's grace and his goodness always precedes something else, and that there's something about the grace of God that always precedes law to the degree where you would have to be out of your mind not to love him. How can you not love a God who's been so gracious that he woke you up when you didn't deserve it? How can you not love a God who kept you when you did everything you could to denigrate and deny who he was? How can you not love a God who in the midst of your rebellion, your hell, and your mean, nasty, do nothing, I don't care, how can you not love that God when he didn't cut you off, take your life, and woke you up day after day after day? And how can you not love that God who has manifested his grace in your life time and time again? That's why we testify, I should have been dead, I should have been gone, I should have lost my mind, I should have been divorced, and even when I was divorced, he picked me back up, turned me around, and let me know that I had value and worth in his eyes. How can you not love that God? Yes, I'm glad that God kept things together, but some of you have lived fractured lives in 2016, and in the midst of your fracture, he still put you back together again. You got no business in church on the first Sunday of the new year, but God put you back together again, put you in your right mind, gave you back your scruples again, and now you can see clearly that this is behind me does not define me. Praise, glory to our Christ. I'm just trying to tell you that when you've been gripped by his grace, you got to realize that there's a grace that precedes unconditional promises. When he tells Abraham to get up and go to a land that I will show you, he doesn't say, Abraham, first do this and then. The promise given is unconditional. When Abraham gets up and starts walking, and here in this text, you have men and women who are gripped by the grace of God, and they recognize that only grace can redeem and only love can give you a new name. A new name, a new identity. You say, where's that come from? A new family. Look at the text. He says, verse 5, do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will gather you and your children from east and west. I will say to the north and south, bring my sons and my daughters back to Israel from the distant corners of the earth. Bring all who claim me as their God. That's a new family. That's an expanded network of relationships. That's people who don't look like you. People who aren't a part of your tribe. But that's what God does. When God takes from you, sometimes what he does is he brings you into a larger family. He brings you into a larger group, a more significant tribe, something that you haven't had before. That's why those of you who are not saved, what you don't understand is that our relationship ends at the grave. I've got an aunt who just died. She's 96. Would have been 97 next month. And praise be to God that this woman loved Jesus with all her heart. And somebody asked me yesterday, are you sad? I said, no, I'm going to miss her, but I'm rejoicing. Why? Because I know I get to see her again. Now, this has got nothing to do with biology, because I have some other people who I am related to biologically, but because they are not Christians, I won't see them again. In this way, spirituality has eclipsed biology, because there are some people who we haven't met before, but because we are bound together by the blood of Jesus Christ, they are closer to me than my family. Come on, you know you got some family members, and some of them are just knuckleheads. Am I right about this? You got some people who you are bound by blood to, but you know in your heart they just as trifling and low down and shady and shifty as they can be. I didn't tell you not to love them. I just said tell the truth about your family. And what God does is God has a way of taking your biological family and sometimes moving them on the side and giving you a spiritual family in which you have more in common with your spiritual family than you have in your biological family. Your biological family want to talk about going to the club. Your spiritual family says, let's worship God. Your biological family talking about buying a lottery ticket. Your spiritual family is saying, let's give to the Lord and watch him open up the windows and pour out a blessing. Biology is saying, let's go get crunk, drunk, blazed, and blunted. And your spiritual family says, bless his holy name. Let's worship him together. That's a different kind of family. And I'm so glad that I got other members of the family, that when some can't pray for me, I got a brother and a sister or a father and a mother that can pray and ask God to intercede in my situation. I got a brand new identity and a new family. Because God designs this in a way that reveals his character and in a way that reveals how he feels about us. In fact, in this text, what you have is God saying that I redeemed you. You have God saying that I ransomed you. Look inside this particular verse 3, the B section. He says, I gave Egypt as a ransom for your freedom. I gave Ethiopia and Seba in your place. And here's all that Isaiah is trying to communicate. He's simply trying to identify how valuable we are, how precious we really are, what kind of treasure to the degree that God has done this kind of ransoming and this kind of redemption on our behalf. Because even though you've got to pass through some things that might hurt you, hurt sometimes can go deep. But there's a love of God that can go deeper than your hurt. And that's how you come up out of that hurt. I didn't say that hurt doesn't go deep, but there's a love of God that goes deeper than the hurt and allows you to stand and allows you to be raised up. This thing about God's redemption for us, I'm proud of it because I'm glad that I've been ransomed. I'm glad that I've been redeemed. I'm glad that there's a new value that God has assigned to me and you need to assign to yourself. Stop letting people treat you like trash. I'm not talking about a kind of narcissistic or a kind of self-absorbed. I'm talking about a kind of recognition that I have value because of who God is and who God has made me. Anytime he has ransomed Egypt and Ethiopia, anytime he has redeemed me that way, he is telling me that I am the apple of his eye, precious in his sight. He has said, I've honored you and I love you. Stop letting people treat you like trash and stop treating yourself like trash. I'm stymied here because what gave me difficulty was this idea that somehow I've been ransomed. He's paid a ransom for me. And I'll tell you my own personal struggle. You see, I often use an ATM machine, especially if there's no surcharge. But every now and then, I get caught out. And I've got to use an ATM. And I can't stand surcharges. And for God's sake, don't get caught out the country. Because surcharges are like $7, $10 to get your money. Reverend, that ain't never made sense to me. Why I gotta pay to get my money? It seems to me that if I gotta use an ATM machine and it's my money, I ought to be able to get my money for free since you've already made more on it than you ever gonna let me know. But every now and then I'm pressed where I don't have a choice. I need the cash because they won't accept a credit card and I gotta use an ATM and I gotta pay for something I already bought. I'm glad God is not like me. You see, when I hear God say that he ransomed, I'm glad God didn't feel that way about us. Because when you talk about redemption and when you talk about God ransoming us, one of the reasons why we are of a new value, a new treasure, is because what God did was God bought back what he already owned. You see, God was willing to pay the surcharge. You're not hearing me. I said God was willing to pay the surcharge to buy back what he already owned, and the price that he paid was much more than you could imagine. But aren't you glad that he ransomed you? Aren't you glad that he redeemed you? Aren't you glad that he bought you back by paying the price for what he already owned? You say, how did he do it? He sent his son. And his son died so that you could be brought back and reconciled into a relationship that you had from the very beginning. So God bought back again what he owned the first time, and I'm glad that he brought me back. Here's what God says, there's a new value, but he says, forget all that. I'm going to show you something you haven't seen before. I'm going to show you what new paths look like when you walk on them. I mean, think about it. This is a God who can create water in a desert. This is a God who turned and created a desert in the midst of water. And so you need to know that there are new paths. Yes, you got to walk through it. You got to go. You got to recognize that sometimes the hurt will be deep, but there's a love that will be deeper. And that there's a God who has promised, in light of this new identity, in light of this new value, This is a God who says, forget all that. I'm going to make a brand new way. Somebody said, how do you know that? Because he did it before. In fact, the reason he had Isaiah point them back to the creation is to help them to realize that if I did it then, I can absolutely do it one more time. And in the same way I delivered, in the same way I prepared, in the same way I prepared paths for you to walk on then, I'm creating some new pathways for you in 2017, and you ain't seen nothing yet. You think that was something. I'm just building your resume so you can always talk about a God who is faithful. You can talk about a God whose grace can redeem and his love can rename. I'm showing you what I can do in your life because I want you to be the witnesses to the world, to help them to realize what it is I can be for them if you but bear witness for me. You see, the thing about the grace of God and the thing about the redemption of God is that it has no grandchildren. You got to experience God for yourself. Redemption can't be inherited. You have to experience it for yourself. You can't pass redemption on to somebody else. You got to experience God for you. And you've got to know what God has done for you, what God has done in your life, and that enables you to bear witness to who he will be in 2017. Listen, I realize that there was a toy very hot this year called Hatchimals. And all I want you to know is I think a Hatchimal is a great toy, but I've seen some other great toys. And I looked at it and I thought, that's pretty cute, that's nice. But my initial thought was, you ain't seen nothing. Because when I grew up, there was another toy. Long before there were Hatchimals, there was a toy called a Weeble. Anybody remember the Weeble? It was shaped like an egg, but it was really heavy on the bottom. And what you would do with the Weeble is you would knock it all kind of ways. And you would knock the Weeble down, but the Weeble would always come back vertical. Because you could knock a Weeble down and you could make a Weeble wobble. In fact, Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. You know why they don't fall down? It's because they've got a base and a weight on the bottom that holds them fast, that no matter how many times you knock them down, they come right back vertical again. In 2017, you might get knocked down, but tell somebody, Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. And I may go down, but you ain't seen nothing yet. I'm coming back up, wiser, stronger, more committed in 2017. Why? Because God will do a new thing in his people, in this land. If you love him, just say yeah. Let God use you and do a brand new thing. You ain't seen nothing yet.